Japan, the mecca of video games. Before the rise of Western and Chinese markets, Japanese industry made around 50% of all video game revenue in mid-2000s. Over years, the impact of Japan dropped slightly, but still despite the population drop-off, Japan is still a highly profitable market which influenced the whole world. Back then, Japan was king of kings, and his gaming behemoths became synonym of industry itself. Everyone knows the big names: Nintendo, Sega, Sony, Namco, Konami, Capcom, Square Enix. While these big dogs of video game industry started to take the upper hand in general, it took several years to reach this point. And many people today forget about who was the first Japanese behemoth. In this episode we will talk about the birth of Japanese video game market and arrival of first amongst the behemoths of Japanese video game industry. His name was Taito Corporation. For our mapping, I will talk about the early years of Taito Corporation because this company over decades put a big mark in history. So sooner or later this company will get a special video when I cover all important. Taito Corporation is a Japanese video game and entertainment company based in Shinjuku in Tokyo. It specialized in video games, toys and amusement arcades. The company was founded by Ukrainian businessman Mikhail Kogan in 1953 as a Taito trading company, importing vodka, vending machines and jukeboxes into Japan. It began production of video games in 1973, and in 2005 Taito was purchased by Square Enix and becoming a wholly owned subsidiary by 2006. But in 1960s, Taito alongside other big Japanese electronics companies saw the influence of electromechanical arcade games from United States. While most noticeably the biggest game was Periscope from 1966, Taito itself also tried to create something, most known Crown Soccer Special from 1967 and Crown Basketball from 1968. This American influence occurred also in video games, because success of Pong logically led into creation of local clones and ports. It was easy to recreate and a lot of other games were very close to visuals and logic of Pong itself. Taito's first shot was Pong from 1973, which had solid success, but they were not the first who tried to recreate Pong's success into local Japanese market. However, this cannot last forever. Impact of Pong was of course massive, but doing something similar over and over again without any bigger improvements led obviously into stagnation. But one man changed the history forever with his ideas and passion. His name was Tomohiro Nishikado. Tomohiro Nishikado, a Tokyo Denki University engineering graduate who joined the company in 1968, was instrumental in the company's transition to the video games. Nishikado developed Skyfighter, a target-shooting electromechanical game released by Taito for amusing arcades in 1971. The game used mirrors to protect images of model planes in front of a moving sky blue background from a film canister on a rotating drum. The game was a hit, but too large for most locations, so it was followed by a scaled-down version named Skyfighter 2, which sold around 3,000 arcade cabinets. Taito believed that transistor logic, or shortly TTL technology, would play a significant role in the arcade industry, so they tasked Nishikado with investigating this technology, as he was the company's only employee who knew how to work with integrated circuits, and one of the few engineers at any Japanese coin-op company with significant expertise in solid-state electronics. Nishikado began working on video game development in 1972. He was interested in creating arcade video games, so he spent 6 months dissecting Actaris Pong arcade unit and learning how the game's integrated circuits worked, and began modifying the game. He developed Pong, which was similar to Pong, one of Japan's earliest locally produced arcade video games, released in 1973. His first original arcade video games were the Pong-style sports video games like Soccer and Davis Cup, when Soccer was developed first, but both released in November 1973. Davis Cup was a team sport video game, a tennis doubles game with similar ball and paddle gameplay to Pong, but played in doubles, allowing up to 4 players to compete, like Atari's Pong doubles from 1973. Soccer was also a team sport video game based on association football. Soccer was literally similar like Davis Cup, allowed each player to control both a forward and a goalkeeper and let them adjust the size of the players who were represented as the paddlers on the screen. Nishikado considers soccer to be Japan's first original domestically produced video game. Even Basketball was an arcade basketball video game released by Taito in 1974. It was the earliest use of character sprites to represent human player characters in a video game. The gameplay was largely similar to earlier ball and paddle games, but with human-like characters rather than simple rectangles. Nishikado also came up with concept by taking a typical Pong game and rearranging the shapes. It was also the earliest basketball video game in arcades and the second basketball themed video game in general after the basketball overlay released for Magnavox Odyssey console in 1973. Speed Race was a driving racing video game released in November 1974. He considers it to be his favorite among the games that he worked on. It was also one of the first Japanese video games released in North America, where it was distributed by Midway. Running on Taito discrete logic hardware, the game used sprites with a collision detection. The game's most important innovation was the introduction of scrolling graphics, where the sprites moved along a vertical scrolling overhead track, with the course wind becoming wider or narrower as the player's car moves up the road, while the player races against other rival cars. The faster the player's car drives, the more the score increases. The game's concept was adapted from 2 earlier electromechanical driving games, Casco's Minute Drive from 1958 and Taito's Super Road 7 from 1970. In contrast to the volume control dials used in his earlier Pong-inspired machines, Speed Race had a realistic racing wheel controller, accelerator, gear shift, speedometer, and tachometer. It could be played in either single player or alternating 2 players, where each player attempts to beat the other's score. The game also had selectable difficulty levels, giving players an option between Beginner's Race and Advanced Player's Race. The game was rebranded as Wheels by Midway for release in the United States and was influential on later racing games. Midway also released a version called Racer in the United States, and Wheels 2 later sold over 10,000 cabinets in the United States to become the best-selling arcade game of 1975. His next major title was Western Gun, known as a gunfight in the United States, released in 1975. The game's concept was adapted from a Sega arcade electromechanical game called Gunfight from 1969, with the cowboy figurines adapted into character sprites and both players able to maneuver across a landscape while shooting each other. The game is historically significant for several reasons. It was an early on-foot, multi-directional shooter that could be played in single-player or 2-player. It also introduced video game violence, being the first video game to depict human-to-human combat and the first to depict a gun on screen. The game introduced dual-stick controls, one 8-way joystick for movement and the other for changing the shooting direction, and it was also one of the earliest video games to represent game characters and fragments of story through its visual presentation. The player characters used in the game represent avatars for the players and would yell "Got me" when one of them is shot. Other features of the game include obstacles such as cactus, and in later levels pine trees and moving wagons that can provide cover for the players and are destructible. The guns have limited ammunition, with each player limited to 6 bullets, and shot can ricochet off of the top of the bottom edges of the playfield, allowing to indirect hits to be used as a strategy. Western Gun was his next game licensed to Midway for release in the United States, with the title changed to Gunfight for its American release. Midway's Gunfight adaptation was itself notable for being the first video game to use a microprocessor. Nishikado's Western Gun allowed the 2 players to move around anywhere on the screen, whereas a mid version of Gunfight restricts each player to their respective portions of the screen, with the characters made larger in size. Nishikado believed that his original version was more fun, but was impressed with the improved graphics and smoother animation of Midway's version. This led him to design microprocessors to his subsequent games. Gunfight was a success in arcades, selling around 8,600 arcade cabinets in the United States, where it was the third highest grossing arcade game of 1975 and second highest grossing arcade game of 1976. The game was ported to the Bally Astrocade console and several computer platforms. Gunfight's success helped to pave the way for Japanese video games in the American market. And lastly, Nishikado developed a game named Interceptor, which was a first-person combat flight simulator. The game was first demonstrated in 1975 before releasing in Japan in March 1976. It involved piloting a jet fighter, using an 8-way joystick to aim with a crosshair and shoot an enemy aircraft that move in formations of 2, can scale in size depending on their distance to the player, and can move out of the player's firing range. The game used a form of pseudo 3D object scaling to create the illusion of 3D space, a technique that was later used in racing video games such as Atari's Night Driver from 1976 and Namco's Pole Position from 1982, and more extensively in Sega Super Scare arcade games during the mid to late 1980s. As you see, all of his early work shifted the view of video games. Nishikado revolutionized the game creation and opens new options for the new forming industry, because change from static visuals to more dynamic thanks to invention of vertical scrolling, for example, very quickly became a standard and thing that we which today even not notice. It's just a normal thing in modern games. Nishikado's work is often cited with a pioneering status, and many great game developers of all time acknowledge his work as influential, especially the impression from Shigeru Miyamoto, who will later become the greatest amongst all, often said that Nishikado's work inspired him to start gaming development. Nishikado and his pioneering status is vaguely forgotten, with one exception, which we will talk about in one of the next episodes. But thanks to him, the video games got the look and systems. Thank you so much for watching, see you next time. And that exception, what I will talk later, is something that finally put video games into landmark of the whole society and started a new era for the new medium. The name of exception and Nishikado's finest work is Space Invaders.